Welcome to Insight 2022, Day 2, Session 2. And this is our annual festival of learning and sharing events for the NHS, local government, and other partners across health and care. The theme this year is the science and craft of decision making. Just before we get started, we've got a couple of housekeeping announcements. Just to say, if you could keep your microphones muted during the session while Dennis is presenting, introduce yourself in chat box before we get started. We're going to be taking questions. Dennis is going to try and handle them during the presentation, but if you could put them in the chat, we've got a nominated speaker to pick out the questions at appropriate times and feed them into Dennis. So any we don't cover, we'll try and cover towards the end if we've got time. The session is being recorded. It will be put up on the website as soon as we can get it up there. There's a little bit of technical editing and whatnot that needs to go on, but that'll get uploaded to the website very soon. If you use Twitter, you can tweet about our sessions using hashtag Insight2022, or you can tweet us at MidlandsDSN and at strategy_unit. Okay, I am very excited. In the first of this afternoon's session, I'm happy to introduce Dennis Sherwood. He's a leading expert on systems thinking. Systems thinking can be hugely valuable for complex decision making, for taming complexity, and bringing decision makers to a shared understanding. In this session, we'll be looking at how the science of systems thinking can support the craft of wise decision making. And Dennis will be using a case study based on primary care to show us how causal loop diagrams can be an insightful tool for decision making, not just in primary care, but in health and care as a whole. So over to Dennis.
Super. Thank you very much, Stacey, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Midlands Unit, for inviting me to contribute to the event today. And, you know, the science and craft of decision making. We could spend a whole hour discussing what that really means and how you know you've done it well. So let me short circuit that with just a sentence or two. To my mind, decision making is all about choice. If you don't have any choices, there's no decision to make, you just do it. But when you have choices, it's up to you to decide which of the choices available you choose to pursue. And the decision you take will roll out in time. So what's a wise decision? To me, a wise decision is one that in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years afterwards, you look back and you say, given the information I had available to me at the time, I still did the best thing that was possible. And let's hope that other people agree with you as well. Now, in order to take that wise decision in advance rather than to spot it from the future, you have to anticipate what the future is going to look like. And everyone participating this afternoon is in the middle of a hugely complex web. And taking a decision now is going to roll out in all sorts of ways into the future. So how can you future-proof that decision and ensure it's wise? Well, it's by understanding how that's going to evolve over time is key to that. And that's understanding the nature of the system. And indeed, the system is the key word here. I just went back to the February 2021 white paper on ICSs. It's 75 pages long. And the word system is referenced 251 times, an average of 3 times a page. So understanding systems is really key to that. And of course, systems thinking is integral. And I'll be talking about that. Now, if you're unfamiliar with systems thinking, I hope that's not going to be a problem. I'll explain it as we go along. For experts in systems thinking, and there'll be a lot of you out there, please chip in and help me, make it better, enrich it. Fantastic. For those of you who are system dynamics modelers, I hope you're not going to be disappointed, because I'm not going to show a simulation model. I'm not going to talk about that at all. I'm still focusing on thinking. Now, as it turns out, the Insight 2022 programme is a true role model in wise systems design, because each of the bits are fully integrated and they're coming in the right order. So my presentation this afternoon is very complementary to Eric Wolstenholme's this morning, if you participated in that. He was talking about systems thinking as applied to secondary care and hospitals, I'm looking at the perspective from general practice primary care. So those are two vital links which fit together. It's not the whole story. There's social care and other things as well. But this is a major part of the story. And indeed, referring back to Nigel Edwards yesterday, he put some really important stakes in the ground. He said that we really need to build a shared understanding, fundamental to wise decision making. How do you get that shared understanding? We all have to see the same system in the same way, which is usually very, very odd, because I see the system from my perspective as a whatever, you system see it from your perspective as a whatever, and often they don't meet in the middle, but they are joined up. It's the old story of the elephant. So systems thinking really enables that to happen, as I trust I will demonstrate. So I'll be building on what Nigel was saying yesterday, complementary to Eric this morning. So let's get going. I'm going to go into screen share. Forgive me while I fiddle for a moment. Fiddling in progress. Okay, you should be seeing a blank screen. So let me start populating the screen there. This is where I start the story. The number of patients successfully managed in a timely manner through my GP practice. I'm behaving as a GP, I'm looking through my eyes. And that's pretty important because people are coming through the door and I'm looking after them, and I want them to be successfully managed as completely as possible by me now in a timely manner. So let's think of some of the drivers of that. Well, over here, we've got the practice capacity and capability. And this arrow here, it's a solid arrow, that's got meaning. That says that the primary care practice capability and capacity influence the number of patients successfully managed. And the causality goes that way round rather than the other way round. That's the direction of the arrow. Now, there's another piece of information in that arrow as well. Broadly speaking, the greater the capacity and capability, the greater the number of patients that will be managed through my practice in a timely manner. Likewise, the lesser the capability and capacity, the fewer number of patients. So as that goes up, that goes up. As that one comes down, that one comes down. That's all implied by that solid arrow there. It's part of the rules of the game for systems thinking causal loop diagrams. And of course, this is also driven by what's available to you. And that in turn, of course, is driven by the funding. So the greater the funding, the greater the skills and experience available, the greater the practice capability, the greater the number of patients that I can successfully manage. That's the way these stories go. Now, there's a lot of blank space on the screen. As we go through, I'm going to fill the space. So what happens next? Let's come here. Okay, this says that the more patients I can successfully manage in a timely manner, the overall quality of the practice improves and has higher regard. And that's good for my well-being as a practitioner, because I want the practice to have a good quality, and I can deliver that quality by treating all the patients that come through my door in a timely way. Now, the number of cases I can treat itself depends on the number of cases presented. And that also depends on the patient list. So if I've got a very big patient list, the probability is that a load of people will come through the door, rather more rather than fewer, and that will influence whether or not I can treat them. And that in turn is influenced by the case complexity, variety, and unfamiliarity. The more complex the cases, the more time it takes me to deal with any one individual, the more unfamiliar it is, the more variety there is. These all diminish the ability to look after patients in a timely manner. And you'll see that this arrow here is different from these. This is a dashed arrow, not a solid arrow. Now, with a solid arrow, it meant that the greater the capacity, the greater the number of patients I could treat in any one time slot. The dashed arrow is the other way around. The more complex the case is, the more unfamiliar, the greater that number, the smaller that number. So the complexity restricts the number of patients that can be successfully managed. Now, in other causal loop diagrams you might see or have drawn or have come across, the notation could be rather different. Some people represent this kind of arrow with a little s or a plus sign, and this kind of arrow with a little o or a minus sign. Given that the arrows are one of two types, I find it a lot easier just to incorporate that as solid arrows or dashed arrows. So that's the story so far. What happens next? Well, the demographics have a lot of play in this game. So depending on the demographics will depend on the case complexity and variety. A demographic which is locally of more elderly people will be more demanding than equivalent of younger people. And also it will determine the number of cases presented. And you'll see this arrow is rather different again. This has got a blob on it. Now, the little blobs mean they can work both ways. The demographics can either increase or decrease complexity, increase or decrease the number of cases presented. So they could work either way. So to recognize that that's a different class of arrow, it uses that little blob there. So you'll see some arrows, most of them will be solid, some arrows will be dashed, and a few arrows will have a blob.
I'm sorry to stop you, Dennis. There seems to be a question from the floor.
Yeah.
Hi, not all elements of display can be seen, e.g. the bottom extreme right of presentation.
Bottom extreme right is here.
Yeah, there's nothing in it yet, is there?
There's nothing there yet. Can you see practitioner well-being?
Just to butt in with my tuppence, we can just see the very top of the word practitioner, nothing beneath that. But for people missing the stuff on the right, if you move up to where you can see the picture of Dennis speaking, there's options there and you can change the size of those video displays there. And so you can just have the second one from the left will show a small video of just the active speaker, which is Dennis. And you can move that also out of the way so it won't cover up the right hand of the screen.
Thank you, Mike. Really appreciate that. I'm sure we can all take that on board and just change our visuals because I can see everything fine, Dennis. So nothing to worry from your point of view.
Thank you so much for participating in that, because I'm seeing my screen, I'm seeing the whole picture. The whole picture kind of has value, so it really is good to see the whole picture. But actually there's a lot missing. You should see funding middle right, practitioner well-being deep bottom, and this stuff about patients in the middle there. Thanks ever so much. Do let me know if something else is missing as we go through, and we'll see what else happens. Thanks for the interruption there. Not an interruption, you're adding value. Let me just go back one. That's where we were. We've got demographics, we've got complexity, we've got the patient list. This is what happens next, and let me explain that a bit. This says referral backlogs, queues, delays, and hassle. And this is the difference between the number of cases presented and the number of patients successfully managed in a timely manner. If a whole bunch of people come through because of COVID, I can only treat so many. So the ones I don't treat end up either as a backlog or referral or a queue and general hassle and delay. So this number here numerically is that number minus that number. 300 people are knocking on my door. I can treat 100 of them. That is 200 people. But if only 80 people are knocking on my door and I can treat 100, I can see all of those. So that number is 0. So this is the overflow when my capacity doesn't cope. And it's the comparison between the demand and what I can supply. This is a key part of the diagram, because obviously referrals, backlogs, queues, delays, hassle, all the aggravation from not being able to treat patients in a timely manner is important. And of course, that is influenced by any pressure to limit the consultation time. If I've only got 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever, I'm trying to push people through, which means that maybe I don't do as complete a job as I wish if I wasn't under that pressure. So the stronger the pressure to limit the time, the fewer the number of patients that are successfully managed, and possibly as that number gets smaller, that number gets bigger. So there's a lot of kind of conceptual complexity just in that little bit there, which is important to just bear in mind. Any questions at that stage? Because that's a really key component, how this concept of referrals, backlogs, and all the aggravation of not being able to satisfy that requirement is captured.
No questions as yet, sir.
Super. Let me continue. Thank you very much. What happens next? Well, that's what happens next in some cases. The referrals are a demand somewhere else. So I'm shifting the burden out of my surgery onto maybe secondary care, maybe onto social services. So this bit here represents the outside world where referrals or whatever put a demand elsewhere. Watch this space, because it's this bit which is the connectedness between all the different parts of the service. So you might like to think of this diagram in 3 dimensions, where I've got a layer above here, which is secondary care, where this demand from primary care is the number of cases presented at the next level. So you can see that this is in essence a 3-dimensional diagram. That's not the only thing that can happen. As the number of referrals, backlogs, and all the hassle increases, that depletes the quality of the service. And that's going to affect me, because I don't want to have queues, backlogs, and dissatisfied, untreated patients. So the imbalance between what's demanded of me and what I can deliver comes through here and gets me down. What else goes on? Well, if there's a backlog, the patient is likely to come back, and guess what? They're going to present themselves the next day.
Dennis, does the colour have any significance at all that you're using?
The colours will have significance, thank you, as we complete the picture. Because as you'll see, what's in yellow is what's happening within the practice. What's going to be in green is more about what's happening with me. And what's happening in blue is going to happen in the outside world. But we'll see that gradually evolve. But thank you for picking that up. The colours are deliberate because they're telling rather different stories. So if I'm a patient that has been through a backlog, I'm going to come back and I'm going to present myself again. And a consequence of that is this closed feature. Now, systems thinkers will recognize that as a feedback loop. If you're not a familiar systems thinker, this is a really vicious circle. People present, they can't be seen, they get upset, they come back the next day, they add to the queue, they still can't be seen, and this is a vicious circle. It gets worse and worse and worse, and the referrals, or maybe the backlogs and the queues, get longer and longer and longer, partly because the patients were not successfully managed in a timely manner the first time they presented. So that's a real self-inflicted wound, if you like. But it's worse than that. Sorry about the bad news. You know it if you're in primary care, if you're in secondary care too. There's 2 other things going on as well. If there is a backlog or a queue, things can get worse with the patient. If the patient is left, they're not going to get better by themselves. That depletes the quality, and that drives another loop around there. The other thing is, I might make a mistake because I'm under stress. I don't like those backlogs and queues. So I'm going to make a mistake, and that doesn't help the quality of the practice either. So there's a lot of bad news tied up in, from a systems thinking point of view, these nasty, vicious circles all coming through this feature of the referral, the backlog, the queue, and the hassle. Not a good place to be, but anyone in any level of care, primary, secondary, social, you recognise this. This is your day job. Now, one of the consequences of this is a pressure on me to work longer hours. I don't like these things going on, but if I can work longer hours, because I'm a conscientious bunny, what that does is that in essence increases the capacity. Because instead of working X hours a day, I work X plus 5 hours a day. So there's more capacity in the system. That capacity enables more patients to be successfully treated. So that reduces that really nasty referral bit there. And if you look there, there is another feedback loop here. But that feedback loop behaves differently from the vicious circle. As I work longer hours, this goes down, so I don't have to work longer hours anymore, and I can actually clear the backlog. And this is called, in systems thinking language, a balancing loop, because it stabilizes out on the number of cases presented. And for those who are technically inclined, if you look at this loop, which is highlighted, it is structurally different from the loops we saw before, because this loop, Countum, has got one dashed link. That's solid, that's solid, that's solid. So there's a complete loop with a single dashed link. Whereas if you go round this one here, which is the nasty one, there's one, there's two dashed links. And the difference between one and the two is material. It's the difference between odd and even numbers. And there's a rule in systems thinking. It's one of the things that makes systems thinking so wonderful as a means of simplifying complexity. If you've got any closed loop with 100 links in it, if you count the number of dashed links, the links that go in different directions, and if that number is odd, as is the number 1, that's a reinforcing loop. It stabilizes. If it's an even number, like 2, it will blow up, which is the vicious circle. So we've got a network now of reinforcing loops and balancing loops technically, but they're telling a story. They're telling a story that this nasty vicious circle can be relieved if I'm willing to work longer hours. And you will know how many conscientious practitioners do that in primary care for sure, and in secondary care for sure. What the secondary care sector achieved over COVID in a very visible way, and in your day job every day, is an example of all this stuff. Let me continue. What else? If you think about a GP practice, pressure to work for longer hours, there's a couple of things going on. I put it to you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. One of them is what I call the partnership ethos. It's my desire to do a good job. So I will choose to work those longer hours because it's a good thing to do, because it clears the backlog. But we do hear of some practices where actually it's more about bullying the younger staff, you know, not to go home in the evenings, not to see their families, not have time off. So there are many reasons why there's a pressure to work longer hours. This, if you like, is benign. This one is not so benign, and we need to recognize that. And one of the benefits of systems thinking is when we see something like pressure to work longer hours, we start thinking about, well, what's going on there? What are the drivers? And, you know, are those good things or are those bad things? And that's an important conversation to have in a practice and everywhere else as well. Okay, we're beginning to fill the space. We're beginning to fill the space. There's a lot of blank space to come. What about the next one? Let's see what's there. Stress. If I'm working longer hours, I get stressed out and I might make more mistakes, and that triggers all of this stuff. And stress increases error, likelihood of error, decreases quality of care of practice, and makes me feel miserable. And stress is also linked in through here, because if I'm under pressure to limit the consultation time, that's going to make me nervous anyway, because it goes against my partnership ethos. Stress in its own right, the stronger the stress, the worse I feel, regardless of whether I make errors or not. It's a bad place to be, but that's caused by that pressure to work longer hours, which might be driven because I feel it's a good thing to do, but even I've got a limit, let alone anything else. So this is telling a story, a rich story about what is really happening, because you probably don't have management information systems that measure things like stress or bullying, but they're really important. They're really important. As my well-being goes down, I start thinking, what the hell? Why should I bother? So I'll go into part-time working, I'll maybe retire early, or I'll resign. This is news to you. You've seen this. Hello?
Quick question from the floor.
Yeah.
Is there empirical evidence on the causal links proposed in this model?
Tell me about empirical evidence. What empirical evidence do you seek?
Anna Lamas, could you possibly unmute yourself, please? Or let me know more? Nothing more coming. Anna, if you just add to the question,
Oh, sorry, I couldn't come off mute.
Wonderful.
No, I mean I recognize these links and all these relationships between different factors. I'm just conscious that if I presented something like that, they may ask me whether there is any evidence supporting the links between the different factors.
Okay, thanks for asking that question. That's a really important question. Firstly, the links do not imply any mathematics. So I'm not saying if the practice doubles its capacity, it doubles the number of patients. So there's no maths involved in this. They're just influences. Now, this is what systems thinkers and myself call a mental model. It is my view on how the world behaves, and the evidence is my eyes. I haven't been out there, I haven't done surveys. I believe this to be true. Now, the reason I think that is valuable is because we all hold in our heads beliefs, and those beliefs drive our behaviour, whether or not the empirical evidence is there or not. So a follower of Donald Trump believes he stole the election, even though the evidence is counter. So it's kind of important to understand their mental models. And one of the great features about systems thinking is I can present my model to you because this is the way I believe the world works. Now, if you believe something different, as you might, let's talk about that and let us have a shared mental model, because if you believe something different and I believe something different, we're never going to agree. Let me take another example, Brexit. No one presented the mental model of the system that Brexit would drive, so people ended up in a million different places. So I am not claiming this as truth. I am claiming this as belief. But I think beliefs are kind of important because they drive how I behave. So I appreciate exactly what you say, and what you say is right. But I would be very willing to attend your meeting and meet that challenge and say, what do you believe? And how can we get a causal loop diagram that represents our shared belief? A lot of time gets wasted chasing evidence for what is self-evident, and that gets in the way. It's not that this is evidence-free, it's the evidence in my head. You raise a very big topic there, and it's worth a great conversation in its own right. So I really appreciate your asking the question. Thank you for the timely interruption. But this is my mental model of how practices behave. I put it on the table and I invite comments, I invite enrichment, I invite criticism. Because if we can agree on what it does look like, then we can dig in and say, how do we make it better?
And just a quick follow-up question, because I totally agree with the model that you've suggested there. I'm just wondering whether this could be the basis for an evaluation. You know, like you could use some of that to justify.
Anna, come back at the end.
Thank you.
There'll be more. And the question is, how do we use this stuff? And I think that's very, very valid. And I appreciate that. But let's have this conversation at the end. It'll be a bit richer.
Dennis, we've just had a few more comments.
Yep.
What one asked if this was about cause and effect, and I think it is. I think we'll agree.
Okay, these are called chains of causality. Because I'm under pressure to work longer hours, therefore I am stressed, more stressed. This causes that. So the direction of what's on the head of an arrow and what's on the tail says that it's the pressure to work longer hours is a major driver of stress. Yes, it is about causality.
Thank you. And just a couple of other comments from Ruth saying evidence from insights is really important, which I think we'll all agree with. And you can identify and capture data once you've agreed the model. And this is so important. And thank you, Dennis, has come through. So
yeah. This triggers inquiry and triggers discussion. This is all about telling a story, a rich story, a story perhaps a bit bigger in scope than any one of us might deal with daily, because things are joined up, and saying, well, you know, if this is what the world kind of looks like, how do we handle it? So these are great questions, great suggestions, everyone, and thank you the people that are asking the questions too for thinking about it. Is it okay if I fill in some of these other bits as we go? So this last bit here was on the right. As my well-being goes down, I start getting fed up. The consequence of that is to delete the facility skills and experience available to the practice. If I just go, the patient load is dumped on everyone that is left. Now, if you follow this loop around here, count the number of dashed lines. There's 1 there, there's 2 there, there's 3 there, there's 4 there. 4 is an even number, so that loop, which is in bolder arrows, is a reinforcing loop. It gets worse because that dumps more work on the existing people in the practice. They get fed up, they leave, and sooner or later the practice has to be dumped on someone else in the town. So that's totally bad news, that reinforcing loop, which fundamentally comes back to here. The consequences of that, pressure, stress, and, you know, I don't need it. This is happening day on day. This is, I'm a GP, get me out of here. It's bad news, but it's there in the diagram. Okay, what next? Right, a lot came on there. I'll do that again. Whoops. That's where we were. That's the next one. Now, this is coming around here. There's another possible result of the pressure to work longer hours, and that to recruit or enhance facilities. So I have joiners which increase the facilities skills and experience. So if I can recruit more people through joiners and leavers, which picks up this bit here, then I've got a loop that looks like that with 1 link at it, which is dashed. So that's a reinforcing loop which balances it. So that means I increase my facilities skills and experience by recruitment to match the number of cases presented, and the system balances out. But very often there is a delay here. And of course, if you're going to have people joining, they've got to come from somewhere. And that takes you back to the training policy, because if there are no GPs wanting to move to wherever, or if there are no GPs coming out of med school, you're stuffed. And of course, there's a huge lead time on this bit here. And you've got to have confidence in the future to recruit. And if you're feeling miserable, that's not there. And the practice has to be attractive to a potential recruit. Because if I go and meet a bunch of miserable people who are stressed out, I think, why should I choose to join here? So these are really important factors in recruitment: being attractive and having confidence in the future, which we can all share. And it's getting complicated now, because if there's a lot of pressure to work longer hours in the practice, a recruit will notice that, so it won't be attractive. If there's a lot of confidence in the future, it will be attractive. If in fact there's a strong partnership ethos and much well-being and little bullying, there will be collective well-being, which will be attractive to the practice. So in here, it's all about the culture of the practice, and how the culture of the practice is absolutely central in enabling the practice to survive and indeed attract new people. So this is all about questions which we can ask within any individual GP practice or within a PCN or whatever, and say, you know, what are we doing to build confidence in the future? How do we come across when someone comes in? What are we doing about well-being? Is there any bullying? It raises all sorts of questions, all of which help this diagram work. There's a whole bunch of stuff which I need to fill in here. So where do we go from here? There you go. Another consequence of this is a pressure to collaborate or merge, which in essence is creating more joiners, which increases the facilities and the capacity and capability. And once again, if you look here, you've got another loop with a single dashed arrow. It's another reinforcing loop, which makes our capacity and capability bigger to meet the number of cases presented. Now, these words collaborate and merge are very much on the table, but actually are potentially red rags to a bull to that fiercely independent GP. So there's often a delay in making that happen. So to mitigate that delay, there are various things that go on. So for example, government incentives, PCNs, and the encouragement of whatever organisational units can put gentle or indeed further pressure on practices to get their acts together, absolutely physically, by collaborating as PCNs or merging. And the policies which an ICS might wish to implement, which are shown with blobs here because they could go either way depending on the ICS, actually are trying to fuel that reinforcing loop to increase the practice capacity and capability, to give it perhaps a greater financial footing in order to get that number up. However, there are a number of things going on. Firstly, there are always difficulties of integration. It always takes longer to collaborate or merge than you think. I just can't be bothered. Why should I go through this? Inertia really, really counters that pressure to collaborate or merge. The fear of loss of independence. The whole of the GP world since forever, and including through 1948, has been populated by people who thrive on autonomy and independence. The sole practitioner model was not an accident. It fitted the psyche of the individual or the two-partner practice. So some American multinational coming in to introduce management means I'm going to lose my independence. I really don't like being managed, and the complexity of management gives rise to all that aggravation, which makes me feel really good, so I'll get out of here as well. Anyone having difficulty on the right-hand side, as the practice gets bigger, complexity of management, hierarchies all come in, which is aggravating to that sole practitioner psyche. So all of these things with the dashed lines make that pressure to collaborate or merge successfully incredibly difficult. And anyone that has been involved, many of you have been informing PCNs, getting them to work, or actually extrapolate this to the ICS level where you're trying to operate over boundaries. How do you get that to work for real?
One more question, Dennis.
Going on. Yeah.
It's probably about how you formulate this in your head, but it's how do you decide whether there are intermediate steps between two things.
Okay. How do you build these diagrams? That's a big question. It's all about judgment. Anyone and everyone, as you're looking at this, you're thinking, what about this? What about that? What about the other? That's why this is a vehicle for conversation. This is my mental model, and this is cluttered enough. So when I was first drawing this, it was about 3 times more cluttered. So I stripped out stuff that I thought really was peripheral. And that's just a straight judgment call. I might be wrong, which is why I don't present this as truth or right. I present it as something to think about. Let's talk about it together. And maybe, and I'm sure you're all thinking of things that really should be on that diagram. And I welcome that conversation. That's what these diagrams are for, because the more we can get engaged in this conversation, the richer we will collectively understand what the system does and how it works, and will be in a much position on that ICS board to control it.
Thanks, Dennis.
Okay, so, once again, it's a rich question. This is my mental model. Everyone else will have a different mental model, but I hope we could converge on something that actually makes sense. Nearly finished the diagram. I'm going to populate the top stuff here. So if you've got some stuff on your screen with, mute and all of that, you might want to clear that, because I'm moving to the top of the screen. Just to complete, or pause rather, these things I'll never complete. What next? Oh, right, let's just come around on the left hand here. What about the patients? As the quality of the practice goes up, patient satisfaction goes up. But patient satisfaction is actually not an absolute thing. It's the comparison between expectations and quality. And there's a great example of that right now. When I grew up, the GP used to come to my house. I can remember coming to him in my bed when I had measles or whatever. The expectation is now being set that actually seeing a GP in 2 weeks is okay. So I don't moan at my GP if I have to wait 2 weeks. But it wasn't so long ago that I used to be able to get in to see my GP the same day or the next day. So the government is doing a great job on eroding customer expectations to maintain patient satisfaction, because they darn well know that if patient satisfaction collectively goes down, the pressure on the government goes up, and that leads to a bad place for the government. So remember, satisfaction is not an absolute. It's a comparison between an expectation and what's actually going on. And the lower expectation, the higher the satisfaction. But if satisfaction goes down, complaints go up, that leads to the possibility of regulatory intervention. Maybe the patient list gets taken away from the practice, or there's some explosion in the regulator, or having a row, or being struck off, or whatever it is. So this is a bad place to be when the quality goes down. Bad for the government, so they work very hard to manage that, but bad locally if that doesn't happen. Not good news. Sorry, this is not a good news page, is it? But you know that. You live it every day. Okay, lots of things going on up here. The policy on the patient lists, who gets on the list, what are the boundaries? I've got here disruptive business models, competition policy and technology. When the white paper came out in February 21, it was eroding competition law or changing competition law, allowing the Americans in or whatever it might be. So a disruptive model can have a real impact on how the patient list is allocated, let alone on some of the things about, the size of practices. So that's a big influence there. And very nearly, finally, this stuff over here. Big picture. Public health and well-being drives the number of cases presented, and the complexity. The greater public health and well-being, the fewer people present, and the simpler their cases. And of course, public health and well-being is all about social care, housing, education, nutrition, income, the whole bit, real big picture stuff, and any number of things there. So there's one page. It's a causal loop diagram. It's my mental model. It's not the truth. I don't have numerical evidence to back these things up. I haven't done simulations to show that if this goes up by 6%, that goes up by 7%. But to me, it captures the complexity of what the GP practice world actually does and lives in. And indeed, I'd like to thank GDPF for commissioning the work that led to this. I was doing some consulting for GDPF. They commissioned 3 systems thinking studies, one for LMCs, one for GP practices, and there's another one at a lower level, which is for the individual GP and the pressures on the individual GP, which overlaps some of this a bit, but is different.
Well, Dennis, it certainly caused a lot of interest and a lot of questions. A new one explains that there's a tension of how this cashes out in real terms. So have you got any advice on how to keep the subtlety of the model when it gets used to guide analysis? Okay,
can I just add just one thing just before I get to there? I'd just like to go to this slide here, which is the top bit for GPs, and that's the referrals. That's the demand on secondary care, which has got exactly the same thing going on. And that might be the demand on social care. So this is the overlapping of those things, where the key thing is the funding allocation across the various parts of it. So this is the 3-dimensional nature of it. So I come back to there. So the big question is how this stuff is used. Now, I use these in many, many circumstances as a backdrop to 2 things. The first thing is conversation and discussion. So if we take, for example, an ICS board, I think, would benefit from seeing this, and indeed the others, because they're managing this situation. So the richer they understand it, the better. And I use it with GP practices, where the 3 partners and, the locums and the salary partners get together and they discuss in particular these bits down here, but in a broader context. If I was talking to the government, I'd been talking about these things here and these things down here. So you can use these diagrams just to get a conversation going, to build a shared understanding. And as that happens, the diagram changes. The real big thing, though, is this is something that everyone participating in this event should recognise. Everything should be familiar. Depending on where you are in the system, bits of it are more close to you, other bits are further away. But this is the world as it exists now. So the big question is, does this work? No, it doesn't. We've got to do something to this system to make it work better. So this is a springboard, it's a trigger, it's a bridge to creativity and innovation. Because if we imagine a better world, the diagram would be different. But this is the world that exists. So we need to go into each of these things and say, what would be different about this diagram? How can we increase our confidence in the future? What do we have to do to our partnership ethos? What do we have to do about difficulties of integration if we're trying to merge some practices? So this takes you into deeper levels which look forward to new ideas, that stimulates creativity, and it's out of that that successful change happens. So these diagrams are not the truth, but they are real. We can enrich the truth by sharing it and by enriching. We can then say, how might different aspects of this be different? And this then raises all sorts of opportunities for workshops, for designing a better system to deliver a better world. And that really works.
Thanks, Dennis. A few more questions from the floor.
Yeah.
An interesting one. Has your model changed pre to post COVID?
No. The model is independent of that, because actually you've just got, a real shock coming in there. Various structural things have happened, and people have been, if we go to this one, basically because of COVID, that meant that the backlogs have got bigger and a lot of people got pushed into social care coming through. But the structure of the system actually is robust against these shocks, but how the system responds to those shocks, it's all in there.
Thank you. Another few questions, sorry. What software do you use?
Software for what?
Drawing this image.
PowerPoint.
Thank you. It's a good use of PowerPoint. Could you just recap on the two different types of odd and even feedback loops, please, for the floor?
Yeah. If you have a closed loop, there's one there. A closed loop has a number of individual links. Those links are of one of two types. This link here is called a direct link. The greater the hassle and delay, the greater the likelihood of error. So as this quantity increases, that one increases. A different link is this dashed link, which is known as an inverse link. The greater the likelihood of error, the lower the quality of the practice. So in these, the variables at both ends of the arrow go in the same direction. Here they go in opposite directions. Now you can have a total tangle of loops as on this slide. If you go around any one closed loop, and there's a closed loop that I'm mapping out there, you can count the links. Now any link in a closed loop is either a solid link or a dashed link, a direct link or an inverse link. Notice that these, which are neither of those two, are never in a closed loop. That's outside of a closed loop, that's outside of a closed loop. So all the closed loops are only of these two types. A link is either one type or the other, so you can count the number of dashed arrows. If the number of dashed arrows is odd, 1, the loop stabilizes. It tends to control to a target. If the number of dashed links, inverse links is even, 2, 4, or indeed 0, you get a reinforcing loop which can explode. It can be a vicious circle, but if you change the language or the perspective, it can sometimes be a virtuous circle as well. Now, one of the great things about systems thinking, that diagram gives you a headache. No one could look at that diagram at, once and understand it. It needs to be explained, hopefully in the way I've done it. But this is just a network of loops, and those loops are either balancing loops which stabilize, or reinforcing loops which grow. It's as if the world is comprised of Lego bricks, which are either red or blue. You can make the biggest castle you can, but each brick is either red or blue, so I've only got 2 types in there. So I can begin to understand and tame the complexity. That's one of the real powers of systems thinking from a kind of intellectual and structural point of view. But the real power is what we're doing now. It's putting something on the table for discussion. This is big picture. It goes into things like, quality of housing, down to, am I bullying in my practice? They're all joined up in different ways. We can have a really rich discussion about this. And I really do hope that all of the units across the health service have got diagrams of this nature, which actually are the backdrop to wise policies. Because if I'm going to take a decision, I'm going to change something on this diagram. How's it going to evolve? Is it going to turn out better or not? And I only want to go for the better ones.
Thanks, Dennis. Would you invite any more questions at that point, I think?
That's great, Dennis.
Can I just mention one other thing? Those of you that are interested in this stuff, I've gone through that quite quickly. By all means, please contact me. I'm a real evangelist on this stuff. And also, I've just had a couple of books published, of which this is actually one chapter. So if I might just mention these 2 books, this one called Strategic Thinking Illustrated, Strategy Made Visual Using Systems Thinking, does what it says on the tin. It's all about this stuff. It starts at the very fundamentals. And the case study I've just taken you through is actually chapter 16 in the book. Chapter 17 is about global warming. So that's brand new out, just a couple of weeks ago, as is this one here. Now, this sounds a bit techie. Creativity for Scientists and Engineers, a Practical Guide. It's actually how to have ideas, and the two are linked because this is the platform for being creative, as I described. If you want to be creative, you take what exists now and you say, how might this be different? Now, although Creativity for Scientists and Engineers sounds a bit techie, actually what this really means is it's a book on how to be creative for people who are a bit analytical, people who really like intellectual rigor, as scientists and engineers, and pretty well everyone watching this event will be as well. So these two go together. This is how to analyze the system. This is how to be creative about designing new ones. You've got my website there and my email address. Really, if any of this has been of interest, please explore. The questions have been great. Thank you. Deep questions. I hope I've answered them sensibly.
That's brilliant, Dennis. Yeah, there's been lots of helpful comments in the chat, people suggesting software that people can draw causal loop diagrams in. Lots of comments about it being a really excellent presentation, and that should be recognised that all systems are somehow related to each other, which we could create a diagram, blow everyone's mind. That's from Don. There's some other really nice comments. Sushma said earlier on that they were really struck by the issues of culture, facilities, system on recruitment, reinforcing that we can recruit more or newer in the short term, but doesn't address the wider issues. Edwin said, I believe a shared mental model is the basis for a technical system dynamics model, which you can then test against real world data, and then you can take an empirical evaluation. There are plenty of people that agree the benefit of this approach in terms of flushing out the difference in stakeholders' mental models and identifying potential unintended consequences of interventions. That was from Andy. Maxine's, there's such a good explanation. Just externalizing the beliefs I hold is the first step to shared understanding and clarity. That's a really good comment, Maxine. And I'm glad you mentioned the book, because I was going to say there are people asking, how do we do this? Where can I learn more? So go have a look at that. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. I really want to thank Dennis for a wonderful talk. It really did speak to me, and some of the tensions described in that model. I think even with me not being a GP, I can't fail to see that how some of those connections are made and how that creates such vicious cycles. I do just want to quickly share my screen just to remind you of the upcoming sessions before we finish. So we've got one more session today at 4 p.m. It's lessons for the NHS from high stakes decision making. That session is around the NHS has developed its own culture on decision making and what can we learn from other situations where high stakes decisions have to be made. And it's a panel discussion. It's curated by the Intellectual Forum at Jesus College, Cambridge. And you'll be hearing from 4 different speakers and their experience of working in both healthcare and in other pressured areas like the police, military, conflict zones. And they're going to share the lessons they've learned from combining several careers. We've got a host of other sessions running until the 1st of December. Please look them up, register for the ones you're interested in. The final session is on the 1st of December from Sir David Dalton, and I'm looking forward to that one. He's a governor of the Health Foundation. He's been a chief executive in the NHS for more than 20 years. And his session will be looking at how do you get the desired results from your decision making. It includes not only how do we make effective decisions, but what influences decision makers and how do we create conditions for implementing those decisions once they've been made. So thank you again to Dennis. If people could show their appreciation with the reactions, that would be fabulous. And thank you to all of our audience today and the useful discussions and questions, and to Stu, of course, for being the voice of our audience today. Thank you, Stu.